Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is our final mentorship session for 2025, at least for February. And today we're hearing from Rich Greenman again. He spoke last week on business management and best practices for poultry. And today he's going to share more on facility construction and USDA facilities and food safety. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and discussion.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Get this out of the way. Okay, so today I'll be talking about food safety, specifically facility constructions for processing meat, slaughter of animals, and things like that. Things you would have to get USDA inspectors involved in, what you can do under exemption, things like that. So here's the overview of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to go into the specific regulations that apply. And this is not going to be an all-inclusive list of everything you need to know, but it's going to be the big things that'll really get you a good start to actually doing those things. Sorry about that. We'll talk about some additional information you'll need to know about actually selling the meat, getting it inspected, and then if you are doing custom exempt or have poultry exemptions, things like that, how you can sell meat, what rules apply to that. I did take out the mobile facilities portion. That's kind of a little beyond the scope of this. Getting started here, these are the regulations, the basic regulations that actually apply to slaughter and processing. So 9 CFR 416.2, and all of 9 CFR is animals and animal products, basically. 416 is the sanitation regulation. You can see it on the right side of the screen there. That actually talks about the construction for actually making sure the food stays safe and that the building doesn't have moisture problems and all that. We're going to go into that in pretty good detail. 9 CFR 313 is the humane handling of livestock, and that actually talks about facilities for housing animals and what's required that they're handled humanely throughout the slaughter process. It has some very specific construction requirements in there. And incidentally, all of 9 CFR as part of the Code of Federal Regulations is actually the Meat Inspection Act. This is where it's actually codified into law and has the regulations for you to follow. So if you hear about the Meat Inspection Act, 9 CFR tells you what to do for that. Then 9 CFR Part 307 specifically talks about what you need to do, what facilities you have to have required for the inspectors that are going to be there, because the inspectors and USDA inspectors in a plant are actually full-time workers there. Most of the time they are full-time. You have to build certain things for them, and that regulation actually talks about that. 9 CFR 303 talks about exemptions and how that applies, and then there are some South Dakota guidelines that I'll talk about briefly. But as a general rule, South Dakota follows all the federal regulations as a minimum, and then adds just a couple of things onto it, especially for exempt processing. So as far as 9 CFR 416, now we'll talk about actually the regulations and how this is going to be built to for those sanitation requirements. So the regulation starts out with the outside facilities, the grounds and pest control. So even the outside of the facility has to, you have to keep everything clean and prevent pests. And it's a lot of verbiage here that talks about it, but really you have to, the outside, you're keeping away mice, you're keeping away flies. So the dumpsters have to be far enough away. They do look at the length of your grass and weeds around there, because grass and weeds can, and any kind of junk you have stacked up out of there, it could actually, rodents could be crawling around and use that for a means to get into your facility, hide from predators and things. So the grass has to be really short. Stuff has to be away from the sides of the building, so rodents and other pests can kind of climb into the facility, tunnel their way in somehow. Doors and windows have to be fully sealed. You can't have any dirt blowing in, because basically there's a crack under the door. The door doesn't seal quite properly, and your weather stripping is kind of worn. So these are things you'll have to build into the facility. It's things that are built into most buildings, but when you are doing meat processing, these things are looked at, even for custom processing. These things are looked at by the inspectors, and you'll have to correct right away. So here's a sketch of my processing facility, and you can see I've actually there. If you look at the entryways, the two entryways back here, it's actually, you can have a door basically opening directly to the outside, because then anytime you open the door for something, it's letting dirt into the facility while you're processing. So every entryway, if you look at the top, right near the septic tank word there, there's a door that goes into the entryway, and then another door that goes out. So people go out that door, shut that door, go out, and that prevents any contamination. You're not going to find it in the regulations specifically that says you must have two doors, but they're going to make you do that. There's a lot of things that it doesn't specifically say, but when they come to inspect your plant or inspect your facility, whatever you're trying to do, they will say you have to have these requirements, such as two entryways. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, as far as dealing with USDA, dealing with the state inspectors, and basically they're going to have the final say in whether or not you could process meat there. And if they don't like something, even though it's not in the law, there is a clause in one of the laws basically that says that the regional director of USDA has can add things that they see fit for food safety and that kind of stuff. So you do have to add those kind of things in there. And as part of my pest control plan, you do have to have things like the mouse traps out there. You do have to indicate where all those things are. A big thing about looking at this plant design is there has to be a flow of, so that you're not going from a dirty side of the plant where animals usually come in muddy. They might have some kind of pests on them, flies you didn't get or something like that. So you don't want them going from a dirtier part of the plant where there's mud and blood, and going and you skin the carcass, clean it, and now it's going to go in the cooler. It's all the bacteria is off of it. And then you don't want it crossing back through the dirty side of the plant. So when you're designing your system, you want to go from dirty to clean. So you see in mine, the animal runway starts on the left here. They go to the knock box where they're slaughtered. They're bled out a little, right at the knock box there. Then they're skinned and split on a cradle. They're gutted at that splitting station there. This viscera and head inspection area, that's actually where the inspectors actually look for diseases on the animal. They inspect the lymph nodes and things like that. And then this is actually a rail system. This curvy line here, the carcass gets washed. So I'm taking it away from that dirty area. Now the carcass is skinned and split. I'm putting those carcass parts away from that dirtier area of the plant. Now it's getting washed. It's still not completely free of bacteria, but at this point it's kind of been inspected for dirt and things like that. I'm not going to go into the finer details of how you're going to make all that happen in a full plan for USDA HACCP plan and things like that. But I'm just kind of go through the flow and what's important about the building construction that makes it happen. So then the carcass gets washed, and then just before the carcass enters the cooler, there's an antimicrobial spray that kills any bacteria that's left on the carcass. And then the large cooler is over there. And let me show you this on the left here. This is a picture of what it looks like in the large cooler. You could see everything's skin split, cleaned and free of bacteria. We hang that in there like about 2 weeks or something, and there's no bacterial growth in that cooler. So uh, the whole design of it is made to ensure no bacteria is kind of floating around. And you see there's a hand wash sink there too. We'll talk about that a little bit later with the regulations. And another thing to note up here, there's an inspector's office and an inspector's bathroom. That's those inspector facilities I was talking about with the 9 CFR 307. So going along further in the sanitation regulations, the biggest thing is with this is that everything's got to be moisture resistant. There's no, you can't have anything that if you're constructing a new facility, there are plants that are grandfathered in. New plants can't have wood or things, any kind of drywall that's going to absorb moisture and get all messed up if it gets wet and hold and get mold eventually. You can't have rust on any metal that's in the plant. So everything basically has to be painted and prevent rust. And you can use like they have plastic kind of stuff to cover drywalls that's USDA compliant that you could get at places like Menards and all that. So the big thing is moisture has to be resistant. The whole place can't retain the moisture. And like I was talking about before with having the 2 doors to go to the outside, the same thing is true of bathrooms. You can't have a bathroom that opens directly into a processing area or a slaughter area because then microbes could get blown into the processing area. Then they talk about lighting and ventilation. The lighting, you have to be able to see any kind of contaminants on a carcass. That's real important. If it's not light enough, you're not going to be able to see dirt, ingesta, things like that. And then in the 9 CFR 307, it actually talks about an actual number of lumens for the inspector. So I believe it's 50 lumens at an inspection point so that they can examine the lymph nodes, look for diseases on the animal. So you will have to have a lot of lighting in the not just in your processing area, your slaughter area, but you also need a lot of lighting in the coolers. All the spaces in the plant has to be very bright. And ventilation that goes along with the moisture. You have to have an adequate airflow so that the moisture doesn't build up. You are washing carcasses. You're using a lot of hot water, very hot water for sanitizing things, sterilizing things. So basically at the end of the day, it's like there's a cloud inside. You have to make sure there's enough ventilation. It's clearing out that moisture. Otherwise, you're going to end up with mold in there. So that's something to think about when you're designing the plant. And when you are designing the plant, you definitely want to talk with the USDA, talk with the regulators about, state or federal and the county as well, even about give them a drawing of it and ask them if that's going to work for it. And they may tell you, oh, we need more facilities for inspectors. So when you are designing something for processing or anything that has to do with the USDA, I highly recommend contacting the regional office and working with the government to actually add those things before you start construction. Because if you already have something built and then you go back and they want to add something later on because it wasn't enough, it's going to cost you twice as much to undo something, add something into an already fixed facility. There's some regulations such as a bleed rail has to be 16 feet high. If you design the ceiling at 8 feet, well, that's going to be a problem. Okay, now plumbing is a huge deal in in a processing plant. You need water for everything. So there has to be water, not just at the sinks, but carcasses need to be sprayed and all that. And there can't be any leaks from anywhere spraying water on carcasses or adulterating any product, any steaks, things like that. And the water supply, your sewers, none of that could back up into the plant. You'll have floor drains so that the water doesn't pool up, but those floor drains go into any kind of sewer system. You know, if it gets full, it might start backing up into the plant, and now all of a sudden you have bacteria everywhere. So, um, what they're doing with plants now, and what my plant has, I have a separate sewer system for like the bathroom and things like that. The floor drains go to a whole separate holding tank that just holds whatever's washed down from cleaning in those floor drains. And so that won't back up any bacteria through those floor drains if something gets filled up. Completely separate, and it's not connected to the cooler in any way, such as that. And then for the sewage disposal, like I was talking about, you might need those separate holding tanks, and it has to be separated from the areas. You know, there are backflow things that can be built into it as well if it's going to like a city water supply. Now, if the sewers are going into or you know, the floor drains or the sewage is going into a city water supply, that could be a really big deal, and the county or the city is definitely going to be involved in that whole process and have to approve all that. That's going to be one of your biggest things to talk with the county or whoever you're getting your construction permit from is actually the sewage system. They're going to be very concerned with that. There are plants that pollute the water and things like that, and they're done with that. They're not going to allow any of that. So that's the sewage system is something you may not think about every day, but it's going to be a massive part of how you're going to get that water in and out of the plant. So this is an eyeful here. I'm not going to touch on this too much. You can recycle water in a plant for some things, and I don't do this, but if you are going to do this, 9 CFR 416 is where it talks about using that. A lot of it, the only thing I kind of reuse water for is when I'm processing chickens. The scalding water for the chickens can be cleaned because that's a fully the bird at that point still has all its feathers on and things like that. It's scalding before plucking, and it's just a hot water dip for a little bit, and it has to be filtered out and stuff like that. So if you are planning on reusing water, then definitely look through this. But you do have to make sure there's no pathogens in the reused water, and it has to be, basically you have to create a water treatment facility at the plant in order to do that, filter the water in some kind of way. And then finally, the people have to be clean. One of the biggest contaminants for food safety is actually the people working on the carcass. If they're not clean, if they're working on a dirty carcass and then they don't see their hands got dirty, they touch something else, or they went to the bathroom, didn't adequately clean their hands, that's a big deal. So what you won't see specifically for employee bathrooms and things like that is a foot pedal on the sink. So but they will make you operate your sinks with a foot pedal where you know, you're turning it on and off, so you're not touching stuff with your dirty hands, then washing it, then touching the dirty thing again to shut it off. So you will have to build in foot pedals into your sinks, or some, you know, some way to not touch the sink. So they always say foot pedals, but what would work too is one of those motion sensors. If you could get them to work, sometimes they stop working. That's got a whole other set of problems. So the most reliable is the foot pedal sink. So that's the sanitation portion, and that there's more to that 9 CFR 416 than just the sanitation and construction for sanitation, but that we're going to keep this just to constructing the facilities today. So that 416.2 is where you're going to find all of those. And if you have any questions about that, just ask me, or, there, like I said, there is a lot with that it's not very obvious, and the government's interpretation might be different than yours, because they've seen a lot of other things that we haven't seen. Probably the inspectors have been to multiple plants, and they are more familiar with um, problems in food safety from the past that we may not be aware of. And they've seen this didn't work in one plant, and then they don't like seeing in other plants. So definitely talk to them about what the best practices are that they've seen. Uh, so next, I'll talk about the humane handling side, and this is a massive focus area, and it'll it's just when you have a facility that's taking live animals in any way, um, it has to be handled remotely, even for farm slaughters and things like that. This is a big deal. So this talks about um, you can't have any sharp or protruding objects. The animals can't get hurt in any way before they're slaughtered. When you're bringing them in for slaughter, you're trying to make sure the animals have the least bit of excitement. You don't want to freak them out and make them nervous before. It's a tough enough process. So they can't get hurt. A big thing is icy conditions in the winter. You have to make sure they never slip on anything. So you can see the floors of the livestock pens, ramps, and driveways has to have good footing. When you build a plant, you're probably going to end up having concrete floors and having some kind of finish on them that is slippery for animals. So it's going to have to, an area where an animal enters a building has to have some way for them to have traction. They can't walk in the building and slip on the floor when they come in the building. So you have to have the concrete scored, or you have to have a rail system or something that their feet catch on. So um, you definitely have to watch out from that. Then so if an inspector sees something, and this is good practice anyway, without an inspector, if you take in an animal that you suspect has some kind of disease, you see some kind of weird stuff, it's not acting right, that animal has to be separated from the rest of the animals and put in a covered area in a pen that kept out of the weather, and the inspector, so that the inspector could look them over and see what's wrong with them and if they are safe for human consumption. So part of the system, you can't just build a runway and a pen that's just sitting out there. You have to have a spot to separate. They call it a U.S. suspect animal that is just suspected of having a disease that isn't safe for human consumption. And then you don't want the animals to have to switch directions too many times and get all confused. So that's in there too. It's not to say you can't have any turns in there, but the more you turn them, the more stress it's going to cause. And getting some animals to go around corners is also kind of difficult. Okay, so now we have a plan and we have the animals taken care of, but now you're going to bring in inspectors for that plant, and that's this is where people don't really look at the most, and older facilities have to add in extra stuff. And there's a lot of friction between plant owners and I guess USDA and things like that. This is where it is. So just expect this ahead of time, that you have to build facilities for inspectors. It's going to say things like you have to do their laundry for them and you have to clean up after them. And um, and you also, the inspector facilities are different than your facilities and the employees' facilities if you have employees. So nobody can use the inspector's bathroom, for example, other than the inspector. So you need at least two bathrooms if you don't have something else on site in the plant, that one for the employees, one for the inspectors. Neither could open into the processing floor. So these are things you have to think about before you design the place. So there's other things that they do while they're doing their job. Obviously, their job isn't to just sit in an office all day. Their job is to be out there when the animals are being processed. So they have to inspect the lymph nodes, and that requires things like a head inspection rack. You have to have something for them to look through the intestines and hearts and all that, and that's your gut cart. So all these things you have to have, and they're all for the purpose of doing inspections. So that's all listed in 9 CFR 307.2. I'm not going to go into every single one of those, but it lists out in great detail exactly what you need. It even says you need to provide them pens and things like that. So definitely take a look through that regulation if you are going to have inspectors on here in your plant. Now, this does not apply if you're doing custom and exempt things, because there's no inspector there all day, every day. So you don't have to supply this for exemptions. And like I said earlier, the regional director has final say on what facilities you do need. There are exemptions to this, and it says specifically in here, if you don't require a full-time inspector, you're only doing it maybe once a month. You want to sell an animal, or once a year or something like that. You're selling animals from your farm and doing inspected things, then they may exempt you from a lot of this, and that's going to be up to the regional director, or they may say you have to provide extra things for them. So, you know, it's going to be their same. And there is no difference in this regulation for large and small plants. The inspectors at large plants, there may be more inspectors working there, more employees, but just because you're processing one animal a year, if you're doing it under inspection, there's really no difference. And, you could argue what's fair, what's not fair. But the large businesses are held under the same regulations as the small businesses. There are differences in some of the things that the inspector does, but as far as plant construction, the everything is the same for large and small plants. Just because you're only doing one animal a year doesn't get you out of any of this. So let's talk about exemptions now. 9 CFR 416 applies to everything. No matter if you're doing state, if you're doing federal, you have to have facilities that are keep food safe and sanitary, and you have to also handle the animals humanely. So you're not going to get out of any of that, but you don't have to build the stuff for inspectors like I was talking about. And every animal isn't inspected for diseases and things like that. And every animal, it's not required for inspector. But because of that, you can't just process the animal and then sell it afterwards. It's illegal to sell the meat from an animal that has not been processed under inspection. And there's a lot of confusion about this. So I want to really drive this point home. The purpose of the custom exempt, now we're talking about red meat now, not poultry. This is for red meat. The animals custom processing is when you're processing that person's animal for their own use. So that means that animal must be bought prior to it being slaughtered. Custom processing is for, it has to be sold live. That isn't to say that more than one person can't own an animal. So an animal could come in and has 4 owners because it was sold in quarters. And everybody's going to get 1/4 of the meat from that animal, but that animal has to be sold before it's slaughtered, and you have to know who those people are before it's slaughtered. And you also, so in the regulation, it says that for custom processing, it's for that person and their immediate family and unpaid guests, which means even you can't have an animal custom processed and then give the meat away to other places even. That's not immediate family. It's very specific. So you definitely want to look into that. If you are doing custom exempt, you're doing animals even for yourself, that would be custom processing. Um, and there's less regulations about, there's a lot of farm slaughters are done this way. They'll kill it on the farm, bringing it in dead. And there's things called HACCP plans. I'm not going to get into now. That's a hazard analysis and critical control point. That's not required for custom exempt processing. And because there's less regulations, that's why they don't trust the meat to be sold. And that regulation, sorry, I'm just going to go back real quick. That regulation that applies to exemptions is 9 CFR 303 is the regulation for the exemption. I couldn't recall off the top of my head. But 9 CFR 303, we'll talk about the specifics about red meat processing exemptions. Now, the state actually does regulate custom processing a little more. So the USDA doesn't really get involved, except to say the facilities have to be good, essentially, and you can't sell the meat. The state does have custom processing, and that is regulated by the Animal Industry Board, South Dakota Animal Industry Board. And you'll have to apply for a custom processing license if you want to do that for other people. And it's $50 a year for that license. They will inspect your plant in a unannounced visit once a month if you are doing custom processing. And they'll have a checklist full of stuff that they're looking for, just sanitation type things, that everything's in good repair. So South Dakota will do that, and they have the application right on the South Dakota Animal Industry Board website there, or you could give them a call and they'll work with you to get that set up. But the requirements for the plant are the same. So they're going to expect you to build to those same requirements. Okay, so there are exemptions to poultry, and South Dakota itself has no laws. The Animal Industry Board does not regulate poultry processing at all. It's strictly a federal thing. And then Public Law 40 or 90-492 actually talks about exemptions. And I pulled these questions from the niche meat processors. I can't remember the rest of the name, but basically, it talks about the poultry exemption. You still do need the facility done correctly, but with poultry, you actually can sell the meat after it's processed. So, I'm not sure why that those are different. I could only assume that it's because with poultry products, they're always expecting you to cook it properly and things like that. Whereas red meat, you might get medium rare and things like that. So in the process of cooking poultry, it's always the bacteria is being killed. And with all these exemptions, there are labeling requirements. But it's more, this class is more about the facility requirements. So I'm not going to go into labeling, but for any kind of exempted thing, it's very important that the labeling is done properly. So red meat would be labeled not for sale, or a retail exemption might, you'll have different labeling requirements for that. But the poultry, you can sell it, but you will need safe handling things on there so that it tells the consumer to cook the meat. And then you'll have to mention this was processed under Public Law PL 90-492. And with that as well, you will have to follow, just because the inspector's not there inspecting, you will still have other record keeping requirements for poultry. So, but that's more of a process thing. But for any of the exemptions, the big thing to remember is you still have to have the same kind of facility as in a fully inspected plant. So other considerations that may actually affect your construction. I did talk about the HACCP plans, and I kind of touched on this earlier. To ensure food safety, you want all the meat flowing in one direction. You don't want the dirty parts going with the clean parts. And that's going to be part of your HACCP plan. And as you do this, so you'll have to think about how you're going to process before you do construct it. You can't just put up a pole barn and start cutting meat in it. You have to think about these things and build those things into it and make sure what the way you've designed the plant is not contributing to food safety issues. There's record keeping requirements that you'll have. So um, you'll need facilities for storing records probably in your plant, some kind of file keeping area, because even with custom facilities, you'll have record keeping requirements. You'll probably, if you're doing beef or some animal that requires branding, uh, brand inspectors will have to be there. You'll have to talk to them. They may want you to keep records as well. So they may want you to keep separate files. Um, so you'll have to do that. And that applies more to West River. East River is exempt from branding laws, and that's a whole other thing. Then uh, you will have to get licensing, like I talked about, with either federal license, state license. You may have a voluntary license, poultry. So you will have to, different licenses may require different facilities as well. And then I've just kind of talked about what's in the federal regulations, but the state, the county, the city, they're going to have requirements as well. So the state's going to have a say in the plumbing and electricity. The county's going to have a say in the whole building construction, and especially the sewage and the and then if you are in the city limits, like I was saying, it's going to be a really big deal building a processing facility in city limits. And I know Rapid City is very strict out here, and they're not super keen on building in the city limits. Where my plant is just in Meade County. I don't have a city that I deal with, but uh, it's a lot tougher, the city requirements and using the city facilities like water and sewer. So that's kind of a real broad brush strokes. I kind of wanted to just point you in the right direction of what regulations to look at when if you are thinking about building it, uh, uh, building some kind of processing facility, and no matter what you're processing, beef, buffalo, pork, um, these all apply. And then whether or not you're actually getting the animals inspected is whether 9 CFR 307 applies. The South Dakota guidelines um, are mainly for the custom processing, but it does have some labeling requirements. But everything with the South Dakota guidelines for processing really is almost the same as the federal requirements. If you do decide you are going to do something, like I said, definitely talk to USDA and the South Dakota regulators, because they may have some things that you haven't thought about. And then the exemptions are a great way to get started. But just realize if you want to upgrade into things, you make sure you think about those things when you're building your facility, that you will have to have inspectors eventually. Most people that do custom processing do eventually get into the inspected, and the only thing holding them back is really that they didn't build the facility correctly. So that's all I have for the formal part of the presentation today. And is there any questions for me about any of these things?
So far, there's none in the chat.
All right. Go back to the beginning here. One thing I will say about the mobile facility is that I did throw that bullet in there, that mobile facilities, all the same regulations apply essentially, and they're very expensive to build. Where if you are doing something mobile, that um, a lot of people do it for more wild animals like buffalo. There's some facilities for that, and poultry. I know that's kind of becoming a bigger thing, but definitely talk to the USDA about that if you do want to do some kind of mobile facility. All right.
One
Oh,
in chat, asking about what you utilize for cold storage. Do you have any recommendations on walk-in freezer facilities locally sold or supported? They have a small plant and are trying to figure out some frozen storage options.
yeah, that's always huge what you do after everything's done. So you could see for cold storage, uh, that picture right there is my cold storage for the carcasses. And on the right side, you see that I have that freezer right in the facility. It's a walk-in freezer, and I kind of do something different where I don't really uh hold that much product. I ship it out right away. I more send out quarters and sides to other butcher plants and things like that when I'm doing inspected. And then mine is just for poultry that takes less room, and I just get it frozen and it goes straight out to restaurants and things like that. So I don't hold product that long. But when we do, uh, in Rapid City, I'm not sure what other places have. In Rapid City, there's a place called Dakota Warehouse that is just a large facility. It's on St. Patrick Street and Campbell Street at that corner there. It's a large, cool warehouse. Um, and what I do is if somebody needs that facility for something, you have to arrange with them ahead of time. They charge you by the pallet. It's something like $100 a pallet um, to store the meat. Uh, I would palletize it at your facility and then ship it over there by pallet. Then they could just grab it with the forklift and the meat will be boxed up in pallets at that facility. And you'll have to pay $100 a month for pallets. And uh, there's facilities like that, but cold storage. I did some industry research about that, and it's one of the main concerns for the entire industry is cold storage, especially if you're doing a private label. Say you bring in something we slaughter, process, put your label on it. Now you're going to go sell it from your farm. You will need cold storage, either on your farm, ranch, or you will have to find a warehouse, and it's very limited. Right now, there's not a great solution um, because uh, the processing plants just aren't going to hold it for you. So I would I would definitely think about the cold storage before you sell it, and when you time the slaughter and selling, that if you can't hold it, it should go directly from the processing plant to your customers as quickly as possible. You know, I'll hold something for somebody for 2 to 3 days, but after that, um, I've got to get more stuff in the freezer. Uh, and I just can't hold it for that long. So everybody, and I'm not the only one, all the processing facilities will probably start charging you penalties for storing it at the facility for longer. So cold storage is an issue, and my recommendation is uh, if you're going to do something like this, invest in if you are going to do private labeling and things, just to invest in larger cold storage options. A good solution too on that point is they do have, if you have enough space, they do have connexes, freezer connexes that are mobile. You could carry it on the back of a truck, or you could just get a freezer truck that you just park. I've seen another plant do this. The freezer truck just parks behind the plant, and and it's just always in the truck that they can deliver it at any time. So I see another question here. If you're not processing full-time, have you found the process scheduling inspectors for slaughter days? So for that first question, what I did when I was doing less than full-time is I was doing it basically every week at that point, and you just schedule a certain day of the week. So every Monday from you make it predictable. They will give you a deadline, like you have to schedule it 2 weeks out, give them your slaughter dates 2 weeks out, and things like that. And they're pretty accommodating. Um, I've never been turned down for a slaughter day. You will have to pay extra on holidays or overtime. And that in the 9 CFR 307, it actually talks about paying inspectors and reimbursing inspectors for overtime and stuff too. So, but if you do set up a regular kind of schedule, okay, the first Monday of every month, we're going to need an inspector. So definitely try to make it as predictable as possible, and you'll very likely be approved. But do it far enough in advance that it's not an issue. You want to schedule the inspection at least 2 weeks in advance. Hopefully more than that. You should really schedule it out. Meat processing is something where the schedule really matters, because how long you're hanging something and all that. If you're hanging beef or something like that for 2 weeks, uh, you're not going to be able to process it. You can't get more stuff into the cooler if it's full, and then it's going to have to come out in 2 weeks. And so it's kind of a scheduling nightmare, and you want to really work on that as early as possible and get the inspectors involved in that process. But I've never seen where they're resistant to working with you on scheduling. Let's see. Have you been able to develop a plan for both inspected poultry and red meat? What kind of changeover? So the answer is yes. I'm actually in the process of doing that right now, where I'm doing both. I'm not doing inspected for both yet, but the biggest thing when you're doing multiple species, even pork and beef, or poultry and beef, uh, it has to be separated by either time or space. So I do poultry. I only do poultry really raised from my own farm. I do the poultry between May and October right now. And during that time, I hadn't been taking beef and things during that time. So it's completely separated by the month is the way I did it, but you don't have to be that extreme. The same thing goes for slaughter and processing. If you're using the same space like I do to do slaughter and processing, you can't be doing slaughter while you're doing processing. So if you have systems in place to separate either by time or space, that's how you would separate poultry from red meat. And they could never touch each other, like the pork can't touch the beef. You could have custom going through the same plant as an inspected, but they can never touch each other. They have to be separated by space, or you have to do them at different times. What kind of changeover do you have to go through to be ready for one or the other? So if you look more through that 9 CFR 416, it talks about sanitation SOPs, which are standard operating procedures. You'll have to make, I didn't really get into that procedure, but you'll have to make what's called the sanitation SOPs, which has a pre-processing checklist, a pre-production checklist, a production checklist, post-production checklist. And in order to get ready for slaughter, in order to get ready for processing, you go through the checklist. This needs to be clean. That needs to be clean. And you'll have to keep that on record and keep that on file and it actually tells you in the regulations how long you have to keep that for. And inspectors have to be able to see that your sanitation checklist. So like I said, there's more to think about than just the construction. And if I go back to this, the other considerations, the record keeping requirements, and those other, a lot of that HACCP training, HACCP plans, record keeping requirements as you go through that process of figuring out your food safety plan and reading the whole rest of the regulations other than the construction. It'll tell you exactly how you're going to get ready for one or the other. And it's pretty specific how to do that. So if only red meat inspected, have you found any issues with your plant development by the processing exempt poultry in the same facility? So like I said, that I was doing exactly that. And now I'm changing to full USDA inspection for the poultry as well. I was doing all red meat inspected, and there weren't any problems with processing exempt poultry at all, other than, you have to make sure everything's clean. And I'll tell you, cleaning up after poultry slaughter and doing poultry anything is a bit of a nightmare because there's feathers everywhere and they get into everything. And you have to, I would very much recommend never doing it on the same day. And I would even put a full cleaning day in between. If you do poultry, doing exempt poultry, have a full cleaning day at a minimum and have a checklist of what needs to happen before you're going back to doing red meat. Because the poultry has all kinds of different diseases that, salmonella and all that. And so you definitely want to have a full cleaning in between. Any other questions there? Hopefully I answered that well enough.
Last minute questions come in. And I think that was good information, and I appreciate you taking the time to share today.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if there's no other questions, then we'll wrap it up here. So thank you for tuning in to listen.